The jungle did not breathe. It held its breath, and that was the signal. Sergeant Kellen didn't need a map or a radio crackle to tell him they were dead. He needed only the absence of the insects. The usual symphony of the Central Highlands, the buzz of unseen mosquitoes, the rasp of the cicadas like distant power lines, the muffled chatter of monkeys, had vanished, leaving a vacuum so profound it pressed against the eardrums. It wasn't silence, it was manufactured absence, a professional stage set for slaughter. Kellen stopped dead, raising a clenched fist that instantly halted the 5 men trailing him. The midday sun, usually filtered into sickly yellow shafts through the triple canopy, seemed to be holding its light above the trees, refusing to penetrate the black humidity that hung over the old French logging track. They were 6 miles deep into contested territory, pushing toward a suspected staging area, and now they were walking into a hole. Kellen wiped the perpetual river of sweat that traced the lines etched by 2 tors into his face. The heat was a tangible entity, thick and metallic, smelling faintly of decaying leaves, and, more ominously, a faint, almost imperceptible whiff of nuck mom and stale cigarette smoke carried on a non-existent breeze. These were the ghosts of men who had waited patiently, who had planned their reception with the care of a master chef preparing a fatal meal. Private Frosty Miller, the new replacement, who had arrived 3 weeks ago looking like he still smelled of dry cleaning in suburbia, shifted his weight nervously just behind Kellen, his M16 stock scraping against his chest webbing. Kellen didn't have to look back to know Frosty's eyes were wide and terrified, scanning the tangled emerald wall that flanked the track, searching for shapes that weren't there but felt imminent. This was the true horror of Vietnam, not the battle itself, but the agonizing paralysis just before, the knowledge that the next sound, whatever it was, a twig snapping, a bird suddenly taking flight, or the tearing metallic shriek of a Chi-Com grenade, would herald their absolute ruin. Kellen lowered himself slowly to one knee, the damp earth instantly soaking into his jungle fatigues, and brought his hand to his earphone, though he knew the radio was useless in this ravine. Corporal Switch Jimenez, the M60 gunner and RTO, dropped down heavily behind him, his massive weapon cradled like a child, its belt of brass links draped menacingly over his forearm. Switch's eyes, usually sharp and cynical, were narrowed to slits, his breathing shallow. He was checking the sector, his focus absolute, trusting Kellen's instincts implicitly. Kellen mouthed 2 words at Switch, words that didn't need volume to carry. Too quiet. They had been moving at a sluggish pace for 3 hours, avoiding the established trails, yet here they were, drawn like iron filings to this seemingly abandoned road. It screamed of bait. Kellen felt the familiar tightening in his stomach, not fear exactly, but the cold, clinical recognition that death was now merely a matter of time and geometry. He ran a damp thumb across the selector switch of his rifle, checking the reassuring click of full auto, and waited. His entire existence compressed into the next 60 seconds, listening for the sound that would shatter the world. The wait stretched into an eternity, measured only by Kellen's pounding heart against the wet webbing of his chest rig. The stillness was becoming unbearable, a heavy blanket suffocating the possibility of escape. He had to break it, or they would be caught frozen. He began to signal for Doc Elias, the medic, to check the left flank, a simple movement order intended to stir the pot to draw fire on their terms, however slight the advantage. But before Kellen's fingers could fully form the hand signal, the silence exploded, not with a shot, but with a sudden, panicked yell from PVT Miller, instantly followed by the deep, sickening thud of a detonated trap. Miller hadn't seen the barely visible tripwire, thin as fishing line, anchored between 2 roots right in the center of the track. The explosion wasn't massive, just enough to shred the leading element's legs and send a shower of metal fragments slicing through the dense vegetation. It was an instant, non-lethal casualty designed to fix them in place, and it worked perfectly. As Miller screamed, a sound Kellen would never forget, high-pitched and utterly desolate, the jungle erupted. It wasn't a single shot or a volley. It was a sustained, deafening curtain of fire from at least 3 different directions, sweeping the area they occupied. AK-47s barked, their high rate of fire sounding like cloth being ripped repeatedly. The duller, heavier sound of RPD machine guns chattered in reply, and the earth spat dust and shredded leaves as high-velocity rounds cracked past their ears, sounding like angry, invisible hornets. The sheer volume was staggering, turning the air into a soup of noise and copper. Kellen immediately rolled right, screaming the order, "Contact! Hit the dirt! Switch! Give me suppression! 1 o'clock!" He felt the sharp, hot sting of shrapnel graze his shoulder, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He hammered 3 rounds from his M16 toward the densest sound, instinctively knowing that was where the automatic fire was originating. Switch didn't need the order repeated. The M60 roared to life, a deep, earth-shaking brrr rap that briefly drowned out the enemy fire. Switch's tracer rounds, glowing orange-red, cut straight lines through the humid air, tearing into the foliage 20 yards away, chewing up trees and sending shards of bark flying. The VC fire dipped momentarily under the weight of the M60's wrath, a crucial 2-second window. In those 2 seconds, Doc Elias, his face pale but his medic bag already open, scrambled toward the downed Miller, crawling under the low, punishing fire. Kellen knew they were caught in the classic L shape, fire from the front and a reinforcing leg of fire from the right flank, funneling them back onto the track. Their primary cover was minimal, a few wide-trunked trees and a large exposed termite mound. The point man, Sergeant Ramirez, who had been just ahead of Miller, was nowhere to be seen, likely eviscerated by the initial blast or dragged into a spider hole. Kellen's mind raced, adrenaline sharpening his focus into a deadly laser beam. They were in the kill zone. The first 12 minutes would decide if any of them saw the sunrise again. He shouted over the din, prioritizing the immediate threat. "Switch, sweep right, hold the flank." He felt the sharp, hot sting of shrapnel graze his shoulder, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He hammered 3 rounds from his M16 toward the densest sound, instinctively knowing that was where the automatic fire was originating. Switch didn't need the order repeated. The M60 roared to life, a deep, earth-shaking brrr rap that briefly drowned out the enemy fire. Switch's tracer rounds, glowing orange-red, cut straight lines through the humid air, tearing into the foliage 20 yards away, chewing up trees and sending shards of bark flying. The VC fire dipped momentarily under the weight of the M60's wrath, a crucial 2-second window. In those 2 seconds, Doc Elias, his face pale but his medic bag already open, scrambled toward the downed Miller, crawling under the low, punishing fire. Kellen knew they were caught in the classic L shape, fire from the front and a reinforcing leg of fire from the right flank, funneling them back onto the track. Their primary cover was minimal, a few wide-trunked trees and a large exposed termite mound. The point man, Sergeant Ramirez, who had been just ahead of Miller, was nowhere to be seen, likely eviscerated by the initial blast or dragged into a spider hole. Kellen's mind raced, adrenaline sharpening his focus into a deadly laser beam. They were in the kill zone. The first 12 minutes would decide if any of them saw the sunrise again. He shouted over the din, prioritizing the immediate threat. "Switch, sweep right, hold the flank." The noise was a physical presence, vibrating in Kellen's chest, making his teeth ache. He emptied a full 20-round magazine into the vague shapes he saw shifting in the brush line, the brass casings ejecting in hot arcs onto the wet earth beside him. He reloaded instinctively, muscle memory dictating the swift change, never taking his eyes off the enemy position. Doc Elias, pinned down next to Miller, was screaming for covering fire. Miller wasn't screaming anymore. He was making choked, whimpering sounds, suggesting a severe injury to the lower body. Doc was working on him, trying to staunch the bleeding from what looked like shredded thighs, the scene illuminated sickeningly by brief muzzle flashes. The VC were focused on suppressing them, keeping their heads down while others maneuvered. Kellen saw the pattern: short bursts of automatic fire, followed by a heavy volley of rifle shots, indicating disciplined, experienced fighters. These weren't nervous local militia. This was main force. Kellen reached for the 3 M26 fragmentation grenades clipped to his vest, his hands slick with sweat and grime. He turned his head to Switch, who was pouring controlled, devastating fire into the right flank, his face a mask of primal fury and concentration, oblivious to everything but the stream of lead pouring from his gun. "Switch, 3 grenades, on my mark," Kellen yelled, the words barely audible even a foot away. Switch nodded curtly, maintaining his fire. Kellen then focused on the center line, where the initial point of contact was most intense. He pulled the pins, the small metallic clinks lost in the thunder, and held the spoons tight. He threw the first one high and deep, aiming for a cluster of bamboo stalks that concealed an RPD position. He waited 2 agonizing seconds, counted 1,000, 2,000, and threw the second toward the base of a dense, shadowy tree mass 20 yards out. The third he kept low, skipping it off the dirt directly toward the main concentration of fire. "Now, Switch, now!" The grenades detonated almost simultaneously. Crack, boom, thwump, a shocking trio of concussive force that temporarily deafened Kellen and sent thick plumes of smoke and debris into the air. The VC fire ceased instantly in that sector, replaced by muffled groans. It bought them precious moments. Kellen used the brief respite to scan the terrain. Ramirez, their point man, was confirmed dead. His helmet was visible 20 feet up the track, pierced and discarded like a crushed can, lying next to a pool of dark, quickly spreading fluid. There was no retrieving him. Kellen needed to get his men off the road entirely and into the thicker jungle to the left, away from the established firing lanes. But moving Miller was the problem. He looked back at Doc, who was frantically tying off a tourniquet, his brow furrowed in desperate concentration. They were trapped between a wounded man they couldn't leave and overwhelming fire if they stayed. The pressure was immense, the sheer weight of life and death decisions crashing down on him. The stench of burned cordite was overwhelming, mixing with the sickeningly sweet smell of freshly spilled blood. Kellen knew that the grenade blasts had only stunned them. They would be back, harder and faster, maybe even attempting to flank and overrun their position while they tended the wounded. He had to prepare for a fighting withdrawal, and quickly. He keyed his mic, ignoring the static, trying desperately to raise someone, anyone in the rear. "Viper 6, this is Viper 6 actual. We are fixed, ambush on the trace, heavy contact, need fire support, approximate coordinates." But the transmission was choked out by interference, and enemy fire resuming with renewed vigor, focused now directly on Switch's position. The VC realized the M60 was their biggest threat. Switch's position, momentarily quieted by the grenade blasts, was now absorbing a concentrated torrent of rounds. Dust and bits of the termite mound he was using for cover flew into the air, forcing him to keep his head down, but not stopping his fire entirely. He would pop up, fire a devastating, calculated burst, and duck back down before the VC could zero in. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a mortar tube, close but unseen, signaled a disastrous escalation. Kellen screamed, "Mortars, disperse!" But there was nowhere to disperse to. The jungle track offered only linear cover, and the surrounding brush was too thick to dive into quickly. The first mortar round hit 15 feet behind their position, sending dirt, leaves, and fiery shrapnel raining down. The blast concussed the air again, making Kellen's ears ring violently. He pressed himself flat against the dirt, tasting copper and iron dust. He saw Switch stagger under the impact, momentarily stunned, dropping his M60 into the mud. Kellen crawled toward him, ignoring the tracers slicing through the air like red knives. He grabbed Switch's shoulder, pulling him back toward cover, retrieving the vital machine gun in the process. Switch shook his head, clearing the ringing, and grabbed the gun back, his eyes alight with animal rage. "They're trying to push us into the stream bed, Sarge. They're flanking wide left," he choked out, spitting dirt. Kellen looked left. Indeed, through a momentary gap in the smoke, he saw movement. 3 figures low-crawling through the dense undergrowth, bypassing their position, clearly intending to cut them off from the rear and box them into the open track. It was the standard tactic, and Kellen knew if those 3 men made it past them, they were finished. Their small defensive perimeter would be turned into a 360-degree shooting gallery. They had to move Miller, wounded or not, or die trying to hold a hopeless position. Kellen scrambled back toward Doc and Miller. Doc looked up, his face grim, his hands red with blood, having just finished securing a makeshift compression bandage on Miller's thigh. "Sarge, he's got multiple fragment wounds. Femur might be fractured. He can't walk. We need a runner." Kellen looked at the two remaining uninjured men, Private Jenkins and Private Cole, who were firing sporadic, controlled shots down the track, conserving ammunition and providing much-needed cover. Jenkins, pale and shivering, looked incapable of running anywhere but away. Cole, a wiry man from Oklahoma, looked ready, his jaw set in grim determination. Kellen made the hard call. "Cole, cover switch. Jenkins, grab Miller's webbing. You and Doc drag him. We are breaking contact left, towards the ridge. Go now." The seconds ticked by, each one seeming to weigh a ton. The VC fire was now relentless, focused on every point of movement. Kellen fired a smoke grenade into the jungle wall where the flankers were moving, hoping the brief obscurity would buy them the time needed to drag Miller off the road. The smoke bloomed a sickly purple-green, mixing with the battle smoke, offering a fleeting shield. It was time to leave the established line and plunge into the unknown horror of the deep jungle, where the enemy was most comfortable and where their chance of survival was thin indeed. The tactical extraction was agonizingly slow. A nightmare sequence played out in slow motion. Jenkins and Doc struggled to drag Miller, whose semi-conscious body was dead weight, his rifle trailing uselessly behind him. The purple smoke from the grenade offered only psychological cover. The enemy knew exactly where they were and were adjusting their fire, raking the area with probing bursts. Kellen found himself acting purely on instinct, his mind divorced from the terror, functioning solely as a targeting computer and a cheerleader, screaming encouragement and tactical corrections simultaneously. He provided rear cover, firing short, precise bursts at the muzzle flashes that dared to push through the smoke. The VC were adapting quickly. They were now using the sounds of the struggle, the scrape of Miller's gear against the earth, the ragged breathing of Doc and Jenkins, to target their fire. One burst clipped a tree trunk inches from Kellen's face, sending a splinter of wet wood into his cheek, a sharp, momentary pain that served only to galvanize him further. He emptied another magazine, noticing with a cold pit in his stomach that he was already down to his last 3. The weight of command, always heavy, felt crushing now. It wasn't just the responsibility of getting 4 other men out alive. It was the impossible calculus of weighing one life against 5 others. Kellen realized that the VC had pinned them perfectly, timing the ambush to coincide with the densest part of the jungle trace, where air support was useless and escape was nearly impossible. They knew the terrain intimately. They were moving effortlessly through the jungle, while Viper 6 struggled against every vine, every root, every ridge. He watched Doc stumble, pulling Miller forward, his face a mask of sweat and sheer exhaustion. Doc was 20 years old, supposed to be saving lives back home. Yet here he was, dragging a bleeding comrade through a hailstorm of lead, displaying a courage that transcended training and fear. In that moment, facing impossible odds, the difference between an order and a death sentence blurred. We ask ourselves, what is the moral breaking point? What would you sacrifice? Your gear, your safety, or even the slim chance of success to save the men beside you, knowing that sacrifice might ultimately be futile? Share your thoughts on that brutal choice below. Kellen knew he had to keep pushing them. He glanced back towards Switch and Cole, who were laying down continuous fire, their positions marked by the steady, ferocious roar of the M60. Switch, in particular, was a force of nature, his tracers arcing through the green. But even he couldn't hold forever. They had to put distance between themselves and the road. Kellen took the last fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin, and tossed it over his shoulder, a blind prayer aimed at the VC flank. The ensuing blast bought them a crucial 30 seconds of confusion, allowing them to drag Miller 10 more feet off the track and deeper into the suffocating green hell, away from the kill zone, though possibly closer to death by other means. Kellen knew he had to keep pushing them. He glanced back towards Switch and Cole, who were laying down continuous fire, their positions marked by the steady, ferocious roar of the M60. Switch, in particular, was a force of nature, his tracers arcing through the green. But even he couldn't hold forever. They had to put distance between themselves and the road. Kellen took the last fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin and tossed it over his shoulder, a blind prayer aimed at the VC flank. The ensuing blast bought them a crucial 30 seconds of confusion, allowing them to drag Miller 10 more feet off the track and deeper into the suffocating green hell, away from the kill zone, though possibly closer to death by other means. Kellen knew he had to keep pushing them. He glanced back towards Switch and Cole, who were laying down continuous fire, their positions marked by the steady, ferocious roar of the M60. Switch, in particular, was a force of nature, his tracers arcing through the green. But even he couldn't hold forever. They had to put distance between themselves and the road. Kellen took the last fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin and tossed it over his shoulder, a blind prayer aimed at the VC flank. The ensuing blast bought them a crucial 30 seconds of confusion, allowing them to drag Miller 10 more feet off the track and deeper into the suffocating green hell, away from the kill zone, though possibly closer to death by other means.
The transition from the relative open of the road to the knotted triple canopy jungle was a violent assault on the senses. The air immediately grew colder, wetter, and the light dropped to a deep, perpetual twilight. Every footstep was a struggle. The ground was a hidden maze of exposed roots and slimy, decaying foliage that concealed razor-sharp limestone karst. They were now operating purely on survival instinct, their movements dictated by the need to avoid the next burst of VC fire that followed them like a shadow. Kellen signaled Switch and Cole to follow the drag line, ensuring they kept moving and didn't attempt to stand and fight a fixed battle. The sound of the M60 faded slightly as Switch moved deeper into the undergrowth, his firing becoming sporadic, more controlled, designed to dissuade pursuit rather than engage fully. Kellen finally reached a point where the vegetation offered substantial, though temporary, cover. A small dry depression beneath a massive banyan tree whose roots provided natural breastworks. He ordered the two remaining fighting men, Switch and Cole, to establish a tight perimeter facing the direction of their retreat. Doc collapsed next to Miller, retching violently from exhaustion and adrenaline overload. The weight of the moment, now slightly lessened by distance, hit them all with the force of a physical blow. Kellen checked his ammunition again, 2 full magazines, 1 half empty, and a handful of rounds loose in his pocket. Critically low. They had to ration every shot. They could still hear the VC moving back on the track, their muffled voices shouting in quick, clipped Vietnamese, clearly signaling their frustration at losing their prey, but also coordinating a new pursuit. Kellen understood they hadn't escaped, they had merely traded a quick death for a drawn-out hunt. He leaned against the rough bark of the banyan, his whole body shaking, the heat of the ambush slowly dissipating, leaving a cold, clammy shell. He looked at Switch, whose face was smeared with mud, sweat, and gunpowder. Switch simply stared back, offering a grim, silent acknowledgement of their predicament. They were now functioning on the principle of minimal resistance, maximum evasion. Kellen knew that the VC would send trackers after them, men who could read the jungle floor like a newspaper. Their primary objective shifted from survival to total invisibility. They stripped off any loose gear that might rattle, the few remaining canteens, empty magazines, anything that wasn't essential for immediate fighting or first aid. They were abandoning the soldier's logic for the hunted man's desperation, shedding everything that tethered them to their official mission. The reality of those 12 minutes of hell was simple. They had been defeated, routed, and now all that remained was the agonizing escape. Kellen focused on Doc, who was whispering urgently to Miller, trying to keep him conscious. "Doc, how bad?" Kellen asked, his voice raw. Doc looked up, his eyes brimming with professional neutrality masking deep despair. "He's stable, Sarge, but he needs a chopper now. We can't carry him far. The loss of blood?" Kellen nodded. A chopper was impossible. They were too far in and the ambush site was still hot. They had to walk out, and that meant carrying Miller, and that meant slowing down, making them easier targets for the VC trackers who were surely already picking up their trail.
The next movement was the most dangerous, traversing a steep, slick embankment leading down to a minor tributary, a movement that required effort and noise, exposing them to the flanking VC. Switch and Cole rigged a hasty stretcher from 2 M16 rifles and their jackets, creating a precarious sling for Miller. The process was agonizingly loud, every scrape of metal against earth, every grunt of effort amplified tenfold in the heavy atmosphere. Kellen positioned himself at the top of the embankment, covering the direction they had come from, praying the VC had not yet closed the distance. He scanned the shadows, his eyes burning, looking for any shift in color or texture that betrayed a human presence. The jungle was playing tricks on his mind, turning shadows into crouching figures and the rustling of leaves into the sound of cocking rifles. He heard the distinct, chilling sound of VC whistles, 3 short, sharp bursts, used for signaling, confirming that the trackers were indeed closing in, coordinating their movements, pushing them toward an unseen obstacle. Kellen threw a final grenade backward, a distraction more than an attack, hoping the noise would temporarily confuse the enemy's pursuit vectors. Then, he slid down the bank, joining the others at the stream edge. The tributary was perhaps 10 feet wide, shallow, and choked with muddy water, but it offered one key advantage. The moving water would obscure their scent and their trail, at least for a short distance. Kellen immediately ordered them into the water, moving upstream toward the ridge they needed to climb. They waded slowly, the cold mud sucking at their boots, the water a blessed relief against their overheated bodies, even as the exertion of carrying Miller threatened to exhaust them entirely. Cole and Jenkins, training under Miller's weight, were beginning to lag, their faces grimacing with the pain of the effort. Kellen took the lead again, rifle held high, cutting through the dense bankside brush. He was driven by a single desperate thought: momentum. As long as they moved, they lived. Stopping meant fixation, and fixation meant death. He moved with a brutal efficiency, using the butt of his rifle to smash through the thickets, ignoring the painful scratches across his arms and face. He realized the VC weren't attempting heavy contact yet. They were hurting them, pushing them further away from friendly lines and deeper into enemy territory, exhausting them before the final assault. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. Kellen paused momentarily to allow Switch to lay down another burst of M60 fire aimed randomly into the woods behind them, a reminder to the trackers that they were still armed and dangerous, capable of lashing out. He looked down at Miller, whose eyes fluttered open momentarily, focusing on Kellen's face. In that fleeting moment, Kellen saw not the terrified recruit, but a dying man trying to communicate something vital. Miller tried to speak, but only a bloody gurgle escaped. Kellen squeezed his shoulder, a nonverbal promise to get him out, even if it cost Kellen everything. They moved on, their only sound the rhythmic slosh of the water and the ragged sound of their collective breath, a small terrified band swallowed whole by the vast indifferent green.
The stream bed offered temporary sanctuary, but the necessity of climbing the ridge bank promised renewed exposure and exhaustion. They had waited for nearly a quarter mile when Kellen identified the spot, a steep, heavily vegetated slope that offered decent cover as they ascended. They had to abandon the stream, which would eventually lead to a more open river, a fatal choice for a wounded patrol. Getting Miller up the ridge was a Herculean task. They had to use ropes cut from their equipment, anchoring them to exposed roots, hauling the makeshift stretcher inch by painful inch. Doc was now administering morphine to Miller, whose pain had become unmanageable, allowing him a brief, drug-induced respite from the trauma. The climb was brutal, every muscle screaming in protest, their fatigue now absolute. Kellen had to physically threaten Jenkins to keep him moving, slapping him on the helmet when the private briefly considered giving up, sliding backward into the mud. There was no room for weakness now. They either moved together or died alone. Kellen finally crested the ridge, collapsing behind a massive moss-covered log, his lungs burning. From this vantage point, high above the valley floor, the jungle below looked peaceful, the triple canopy hiding the recent carnage. But the tranquility was an illusion. He could still hear the distant chatter of VC searching the stream bed. They had been close, too close. Kellen checked their position on the map, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper still. They were still miles from the nearest established firebase, deep in a sector known for heavy VC activity. They needed to rest, but they couldn't. The trackers would be up the ridge within the hour. The psychological impact of the ambush was starting to manifest. Cole, the usually stoic Oklahoman, began shivering violently despite the intense humidity. Switch meticulously cleaned his M60, his movements rigid and repetitive, a sign of nervous overload. Kellen forced himself to be the anchor, the point of stillness in the chaos. He rationed their water, 3 sips each. He pulled out a tin of sea rations, forcing them to eat small, dry mouthfuls of processed meat to keep their energy from crashing entirely. He knew they had to change their direction drastically. The VC expected them to follow the line of least resistance, moving parallel to the main trail toward friendly lines. Kellen decided on the insane option. They would turn 90 degrees, moving perpendicular to the expected route, pushing into the densest, most difficult section of the jungle, hoping that the difficulty of the terrain would dissuade aggressive pursuit. It was a risky gamble, relying on the VC trackers deciding the cost of pursuit wasn't worth the reward. But risk was all they had left. He looked at the faces of his men, each one bruised, soaked, and hollow-eyed, and saw in them the raw, ugly truth of war. Not heroism, but the desperate, terrifying refusal to stop breathing.
Kellen waited until the faint sounds of the VC search parties had moved significantly away from their position, following the expected escape vector down the valley, before giving the order to move. The new course took them immediately into a labyrinth of thick, thorny vines and razor-sharp elephant grass, the kind of terrain that rips clothing and skin with casual malice. They moved in absolute silence, every step calculated, every rustle of leaves sending icy darts of terror down their spines. The silence, once a prelude to disaster, was now their only defense. They were reduced to ghosts, moving by feel and intuition, the afternoon light already failing, accelerating the arrival of the terrifying jungle night. The physical demands of carrying Miller across this terrain were crippling. They rotated the stretcher bearers every 10 minutes, but the exhaustion was cumulative. Kellen took a turn, the weight of the wounded man pressing down on his already weary frame, reminding him acutely of the price of the morning's chaos. Miller, slipping in and out of consciousness, was burning up with fever, Doc whispering apologies as he struggled to monitor his vitals in the encroaching darkness. Kellen's primary fear shifted from the ambush itself to the hidden terrors of the jungle: booby traps, unsprung claymores, or simply stumbling into an unseen VC outpost. They were moving blind, relying solely on the compass and Kellen's sheer determination to maintain the 90-degree deviation. The jungle at night was a different beast altogether. The shadows were deeper, the sounds were more alien and menacing. The heavy scent of wet earth and jungle rot mingled with the metallic tang of fear and unwashed sweat. Kellen ordered them to stop briefly near a small rock outcropping, giving them 10 minutes to rest and rehydrate, their movements restricted to absolute minimum. During this pause, Switch keyed the radio, trying one last desperate time to reach the outside world. The only thing that came back was static, a cruel, mocking hiss that underscored their isolation. Kellen didn't need the radio to know the score. They were cut off, abandoned, relying only on their internal clocks and the threadbare loyalty they shared. He looked over the prone figures of his squad, realizing the depth of the bond forged in those terrifying 12 minutes. They had seen each other at their lowest, their most brutal, and their most vulnerable. That shared trauma, the recognition of mutual terror, was a heavier, more enduring burden than the equipment they carried. Kellen knew that even if they survived, the memory of Ramirez's discarded helmet and Miller's choked cries would ride on their backs for the rest of their lives. They were moving not toward extraction, but toward the mere possibility of survival, each footstep an act of defiance against the overwhelming darkness and the hunters waiting patiently behind them.
As the deepest part of the night descended, Kellen realized they couldn't risk moving any further. To stumble in the dark with a wounded man was to invite a broken bone or, worse, make enough noise to draw the VC directly to them. He ordered them to find a small, defensible position, a hollow under an upturned root system, and prepare to lay up until dawn. The challenge now was maintaining absolute silence and vigilance in the face of paralyzing exhaustion. Kellen established watch shifts, 1 hour on, 3 hours off. He took the first shift, needing the clarity of the task to keep the adrenaline from overwhelming him. The moon was obscured by thick clouds, leaving the jungle in profound, tangible blackness. The air was heavy and damp, and the temperature dropped just enough to make their wet fatigues feel clammy and miserably cold.
Kellen crouched low, his M16 pointed toward the surrounding darkness, his eyes straining for any glimmer of light or movement. He could hear the small sounds of the jungle returning, the drip of water, the rustle of large unseen creatures, but they were now overlaid with the insidious sounds of potential danger. He heard it, the faint, repetitive click of metal on stone, a sound too regular, too intentional to be an animal. A tracker was moving nearby, testing the terrain, probing their perimeter. Kellen froze, holding his breath, signaling the sleeping men awake with the slightest, gentlest tap on Switch's boot. Switch was instantly alert, reaching for his weapon, his eyes asking the silent question. Kellen pointed toward the sound, a bare 30 feet away. They waited, every nerve ending screaming. The tracking sounds ceased abruptly. The VC knew they were close, or perhaps they had spotted them. The silence returned, but this time it was pregnant with menace, the kind of silence that precedes the snap of a trigger or the rush of a bayonet charge. Kellen whispered to Switch, "Claymore, set it low." Switch slowly and silently retrieved the anti-personnel mine from his pack, crawling forward like a serpent in the damp earth. He positioned the M18A1 facing the direction of the sound, anchoring it just above the ground. He crawled back, trailing the detonating cord. Kellen didn't want to use it. The explosion would give away their position definitively, but it was their insurance against being overrun in the dark. The tension was suffocating. They waited for another 20 minutes. Then, Kellen heard the sound of subtle, deliberate movement, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural cough. The VC tracker was attempting to circle them. Kellen gave the silent signal. Switch pressed the trigger. The explosion was monstrous, a blinding, instantaneous flash that ripped the night apart, followed by the terrifying whoosh of thousands of steel pellets shredding the jungle. Screams, cut brutally short, echoed through the trees. Kellen knew they had bought time, but at the cost of announcing their exact location to every enemy unit within a mile. They had to move, and they had to move now, carrying Miller and their shattered nerves even deeper into the darkness.